Hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word Bible Study, a plain and simple book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse study through the entire Bible. We are in John chapter 12, okay? And this is the week before Jesus is arrested. A lot happens during this week. So let's jump right in it and unpack it as we go. John chapter 12. It says 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus was, the one Jesus had raised from the dead. Now, I think Bethany is about a couple of miles from Jerusalem. But again, remember, this when Jesus was in town, he stayed at Martha and Mary's house. So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha was serving them, and Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took a pound of fragrant oil, pure and expensive nard, anointed Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. So obviously she had long hair. So the house was filled with the fragrance of the oil. Now, in another gospel, we see there's a couple of things that happen with Jesus' feet. The washing of feet usually was a job for slaves. And basically, because they were sandals and kind of open feet, they would wash the feet. We're going to see this later when Jesus washes the disciples' feet. But they would wash the dust from the feet when they come in. Now, there was a couple of times when this happened. So here we see Mary, Jesus' close friend, washing his feet. Okay. And then there's another story told in Luke where a sinner washes Jesus' feet with her hair. Some people mistaken that to be Mary Magdalene, which is not so. Now, also the fact that she did it with expensive, fragrant oil. Okay, verse 4. Then one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was about to betray him, said, "Why wasn't this fragrant oil sold for 300 denarii, or 300 days, or paid days?" In other words, a denarii was 8 days' pay. And says, so why was this fragrant oil not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? He didn't say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And he was in charge of the money bag and would steal part of what is put in. Now, this is kind of a lot to unpack here, right? So you hear John with his commentary calling out Judas. Now, Judas pretended to be incensed that Mary would waste this oil on the poor. By the way, this is such a typical tactic. In other words, when you debate, you hear it kind of all the time. People will, what about the poor? And as John says, you don't care about the poor. You're seeking to criticize. Okay. Now, in Judas' case, he said that he was missing opportunity. Now we see here Judas was, you could say, the treasurer, the accountant. He kept the books, right? And by the way, notice here that he was in charge of the money bag. Now let's just kind of unpack that. Like I say, this chapter here has so much to unpack. But let's just unpack the fact that first and foremost, Jesus then had a money bag. I say that because when you see the term used about Jesus as being poor, okay, he was not a pauper. He wasn't homeless, grabbing scraps from the garbage can. Okay. There was one time when he said to a person who said, Jesus, I'll follow you wherever you go. He said, well, the Son of Man doesn't have a place to lay his head. And the obviously question is, will you still follow me? But Jesus always had a place to lay his head. As I said, for example, whenever he was around this town, it was at Mary and Martha's house. So when we're talking about poor, the relativity here is in contrast to, of course, being the creator of the universe. The contrast also is that as the Messiah, he didn't come in the splendor and glory of a king, but all of the royal pomp, clothing. In fact, we're going to see later, we're going to see about his what is called the triumphal entry. We'll get to that later. But again, when he comes in, you can see right here in verse 9. But as he comes through the streets, and this was coming as a king. We'll get to that later. When Jesus had a ministry, now let me just say this. On the other side of this, there are people today known as prosperity preachers. And they have so, in a most dishonorable way, perverted the gospel. The picture here of Jesus, that they would take this, and I've heard preachers say that well, if he had a money bag, or he had to have millions or thousands and millions, and they actually teach that Jesus was wealthy, and it's again, it's a bad. I'm trying to be you know, not to get too out of hand, but for them to do that, for example, there was one minister who perverted one scripture when Peter said that Jesus left us an example. And then he came back and go, that's why I drive a Rolls Royce. So they deliberately pervert scripture to try to say that Jesus was a wealthy man. Another minister one time, when I think it was in the beginning, and I think it's the beginning of the gospel we said here, when I think it's Philip ran up and said, well, Jesus, where are you going, or where are you staying? He said, come and see. And I kid you not, this minister said, see, you had to come and see that he had a mansion. All right, so the worst punishment for those who follow the prosperity gospel is you all lack of prosperity. And keep in mind, I was in that ministry. I was in that for the first 2 decades of my Christian life. So I say that to my foolishness as well, because again, you believe that in hope. And again, not one 100-fold return, not one, windows of heaven from tithing, open unto me, pour me out a windows that pour me out a blessing that I cannot receive. Plenty of receiving. So, but that, again, so the idea here, so what it's saying right here, that you can say Jesus. And by the way, when the Bible describes Jesus, there is another scripture, for example, that just say that his appearance. It didn't say that Jesus was the most handsome person, and it certainly didn't say that he was the most ugliest person. In other words, when you would see Jesus, the way it described, he was average. You saw that he was an average person. And in other words, in terms of his status, then he would be average. Now, you kind of have to look at the fact that his ministry, at some point, he was taking care of 12 men. And then you would have to include those men that were married, such as Peter. Okay? Now, we also know that there were groups of people. Mary was one of them. But there were a group of women, there were a group of people with means that would give to Jesus' ministry. Thus, this is why you would have to have a money bag. So when they would go places, but if they stayed someplace, you had to pay just like then. It wasn't, there was commerce. There was an economy just like it is today. And in other words, so if they're going to buy food, right, that the money bag was there for them to buy food or to purchase really whatever it is that they needed. If they were taking a boat across the lake, okay, unless someone donated it, they had to pay for that. You had to pay to cross the lake, okay, or walk around the lake, which would take longer. So in other words, Jesus had a money bag. Now, what's interesting is that they gave this money bag, they gave the charge of the money bag to Judas. And Jesus had to know he was a thief, that he would pilfer from the bag. Now, I don't know why did Jesus do that, knowing he was a thief? That I cannot answer. But what is, of course, being called out here is, of course, it's his feigned care for the poor. All right. So verse 7, Jesus said, "Leave her alone. She has kept it for the day of my burial. For you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." In other words, why are you picking on this incident? And again, human nature, you see this oftentimes in human nature. That, like, what? Why would leave her alone? I mean, Anyway, and again, notice what Jesus is saying right here. You always have the poor with you. Now, in another gospel, he actually goes so far as to say, you always have the poor with you, and whenever you will, you can do them good. Now, I see the same argument sometimes when people would, if I'm, let's say, debating, I'm debating, let's say on Facebook or someplace, and you're always going to have somebody that's going to come and say, well, we should be talking about the gospel. Well, why can't we do both? Same thing with, and by the way, here you see Judas' motive exposed. He didn't care about the poor. He's looking at how much money he could have gotten for that perfume had he sold it. Verse 9, then a large crowd of the Jews learned he was there. They came not only because of Jesus, but also to see Lazarus, the one he had raised from the dead. Yeah, right? I mean, think about it. If that happened today, would we not want to see Lazarus, right? Would we not have questions? Lazarus was dead, remember, for 4 days, right? 4. And when you want to, so what was it like? Were you conscious? Where were you? I mean, And so Lazarus had become quite the celebrities, right? So again, and now, by the way, so at this point, think about this. Everyone had heard about it. So just understand, everybody heard about this. Everybody heard about Lazarus being a man that was dead for 4 days. Jesus raised this man. Everybody heard about this. So they came to see not only Jesus, but they were really interested in Lazarus. They came not only because of Jesus, but to see Lazarus, the one he had raised from the dead. Now, this is one of these times, don't you wish, Lord, could you give us some more couldn't you have given us some more details? A lot of questions we could have asked Lazarus. Verse 10, therefore the chief priest decided to kill Lazarus also, because he was the reason many of the Jews were deserting them and believing in Jesus. Now let's kind of work through the logic here. You're going to kill a man that was dead and was raised from the dead. That's the man you want to kill. That you don't think this man can get raised again. The point is, when we talk about the sinfulness, the hardness of man, this man was dead for 4 days. Jesus raised this man, and the Pharisee says, "Oh, we need to kill him. We need to kill him. We need to kill him." And not thinking, here's the sin, the hardness. And I often say, "Lord, thank you for your mercy on me." That, man, to be that hard, to have that kind of hardness. Understand that, and people do say, well, why don't we have? Why wouldn't God show us a miracle? If God showed a miracle to the crowd today, wouldn't the crowds believe? And the answer is no. Some would, obviously, but notice here, the Pharisees want to kill Lazarus, not because they don't believe that Lazarus wasn't dead. They know he was dead. They know Lazarus was dead, and now they want to kill Jesus. I mean, I'm sorry, Lazarus. They do want to kill Jesus too, but they want to kill Lazarus because the Jews were deserting them to believe in Jesus. This is some hardness of the heart. And as I said, we see this throughout Scripture. From the fall of man, we oftentimes think that at death that people may cry out to God for mercy. We think about Noah's Ark, that when it started raining, that people were banging on the ark, begging to get in. That's we have examples after example. This one too, that they will curse God. They will curse God. And here are the Pharisees, whom is acknowledging that this Jesus is doing miracles, thus demonstrating he is the Messiah, he is the Son of God. They want to kill him. And they want to kill Lazarus so that the people won't believe. Now, here's the thing, they don't know this yet, but they won't have to go that far. At the crucifixion, the crowds are going to turn on Jesus. But we see the motive. The Jews were deserting them and believing in Jesus. That's why they were jealous. They were jealous. The crowds were deserting and were believing in Jesus. So, a lot of times you think our job is to preach the gospel. Okay? Our job is to preach the gospel. How that seed of the word works in the hearts of people, that's going to be between God and them. But this is deep to me. Think about this. This is deep. When you could look at a man, acknowledge a man, and see that this man is working miracles and still reject him. Still reject him based on your hardness of heart. That's deep. Imagine what that's going to look like at the judgment seat of Christ. See, a lot of times, and let me say this quickly, there are people that will say, and I see some of these comments, why would God condemn people to hell? I'm going to probably pick this up in the next study because that's an interesting question. Why would God condemn people to hell? Look at this, what we just read. Look at their rejection. All right, guys, don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought, a comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome, and I'll see you in the next study.